When working class people, migrants with no papers, no legal protection, when they have no rights, they're much more easy to exploit. So they can't be part of unions, they can't protest, they're much more easy to kind of threaten and to coerce so they just can be exploited more easily. So it's actually in the interest of capital to have people who have no rights. Employers will say, yeah, we need more people, we need more labor force because we have shortage of skills and so on. But if they were people that they'd have to pay properly, that could be unionized, that could fight for kind of bargains for their wages and put pressure on capital, of course they wouldn't want them.
I was born in the United Kingdom in 1984. My great-grandfather, however, was born in what was then called the Russian Empire, Tsarist Russia. He was born in a city called Baku. It's in modern-day Azerbaijan. He had to leave after 1917, the Russian Revolution and the Russian Civil War, as it became known. He moved to Iran, which is where my grandfather and my father were both born. My dad was in the UK, and I was only born in the UK because of another revolution, the Iranian Revolution of 1979. Now, for much of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, we thought those days were over. We believed magically that revolutions and wars and displacement was disappearing into the mists of history, that we were moving into something quite different. What if we're not? What if some of the disasters, war, genocide, famine, that marked much of the 20th century is coming up in front of us? What if it's not all behind? To discuss all of that, from migration to rising geopolitical tensions between the United States, China, Russia, and Europe, I can think of few better guests than today's. Lea Ypi wrote a fantastic book about growing up in Stalinist Albania, Free. Her latest book, Indignity, is about her grandmother's story instead. Like I say, these are narratives like my great-grandfather's from a century ago, but increasingly in 2025, they feel more relevant than ever. Lea Ypi, welcome to Downstream.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you back on, second time.
Yeah, it's wonderful to be here.
Your first book, Free, was translated into how many languages?
37.
37. Which was the sort of, not strange, there's no such thing as a strange language, but which was the most sort of esoteric, unusual language?
I guess a combination of which one was the most esoteric and the most successful country. It was Iceland.
Iceland?
Yeah, because it was a bestseller for a really long time, and it's not a country that I would have associated to great interest in Albania and Albanian politics and history.
We're talking about your latest book, Indignity. Before we talk about that book, I want to ask you a very simple question, Lea. Where is your family from?
Well, it's not a very simple question. So which part of the family? My Albanian family. My grandmother was born in Salonika. My grandfather was born in what was called Monastir and is now Bitola in Macedonia. Salonika was in Greece. Another part of my family is from central Albania. And I'm married to an English man, but also with roots in Cornwall and Wales. And so my children have all this mixed background, mixed roots, and these are from a little bit of everywhere, really.
Because that question increasingly matters to lots of people, doesn't it? Who are you? Where are you from? What is your identity? But for somebody like you, that's quite a fluid answer.
Well, there's two parts to that question. There's a more sort of historical, and to the answer as well. There's a more historical answer, which is very complicated. And then there is a very simple answer, which is, well, what passports do you hold? And I hold a British passport and an Albanian passport. And that answer and the question matters a lot at that level, because what passport you hold determines where you can go, what you can do, what jobs you can apply for, what kind of life you have. And it's obvious that someone who has an Albanian passport has a much, much difficult and harder life than someone who has a British passport. So my brother, who only has an Albanian passport, has never been able to visit me in Britain because he was never given a visa.
Really?
Yeah, never. And now he's not applying anymore because there's no point applying. Basically, the system, it's done mostly these days by algorithm. So you apply, and if you're categorized as an Albanian man of a certain age group, single, in his case, with only my mom in Albania, you're categorized as someone who, were he to be given a visa to come to the UK, would not leave. And so he's not able to come because he doesn't get a visa. It's as simple as that. And this is just to answer your question.
But isn't that sort of racial profiling? I mean,
of course, yeah.
Is there not
There's a kind of demographic, and there's a kind of, it's not just racial, right? It's like age,
Well, no, exactly,
category, and ethnic background. Sometimes, obviously, also income. In his case, it was a middle class family. So, but of course, if you have absolutely no chance to come to Britain if you're an Albanian man of working age with no income. It's just zero possibility, which might also explain why some of them decide to go on boats when they have relatives that they want to join, for example.
But is that, I mean, because I've never heard this before, is that even legal under European law?
I mean, I don't know how, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know what the ins and outs of the technicalities are. But basically, he has applied a number of times and was rejected. Of course, once you get rejected once, it becomes even harder the second time to be rejected. And so, yes, at this point, he just doesn't apply anymore because you probably know also that when you apply for a visa, you don't get reimbursed for the fee. So you spend a lot of money for the fee and you just get turned down, then you get turned down another time. The fees have increased exponentially in the last few years, by the way. I just applied for my mom, who once was rejected, but then other times has been able to. I don't know if she was going today to find out whether she got it this time or not. And the fees have gone up ridiculously. And yeah,
how much are the fees now?
I forgot what I paid for her. Something like, she applied for a longer visa, so maybe for a 5-year visa. And I think I paid maybe £1,200, something like that. Yeah.
So for people who aren't familiar with you and your work and your professional status, you're not just a writer, you're also a very successful academic at the London School of Economics. You've taught there for a pretty long time. You are a British citizen, as you said. Even for somebody like you, it's incredibly hard for your family to come over here. I mean, that's kind of incredible.
In the case of my brother, it's impossible.
It's impossible.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is the reality. This is why when you ask me the question of where are you from, there is a very long story, which is to do with roots and culture and history and where, mixed cultures and so on, and a more kind of romantic, poetic answer. And then there's a very straightforward answer, which is I'm from Albania. I have a passport from Albania. And for a lot of people with Albanian passports, it's extremely difficult to travel and to do anything, to find opportunities that other people have just because they hold that passport. And in that case, the answer of does it matter? Absolutely it matters. It determines your life.
Does that kind of outrageous treatment towards Albanians, people of Albanian heritage, does that make you feel more proud to be Albanian? Does that sort of augment your sense of identity as an Albanian person?
I don't like the category of pride for national belonging because I have an inherently anti-nationalist instinct. It makes me feel solidarity with the people that I share a language and a background and a kind of experience with. And certainly it makes me think about their hardship and their experiences and what one can do and how it fits with general patterns of injustice in the world. And also it makes Albania in that sense special because it singles out this country as a country where you see a kind of site of oppression that in this case takes passport lines. And of course, it's a country I know very well. I grew up there. And of course, I have memories. I'm fond of it. But I don't like the category of pride, if you know what I mean, because I think it's just a kind of blanket category.
You said belonging. I think for a lot of people, those two things kind of mean the same.
I don't know, because, belonging can be pride is always unambiguously positive, right? I'm proud of my country. Belonging can also be, you can also not like your country sometimes, and you can be frustrated and resentful with your fellow countrymen and women. And I think it's a much more complex category, which is not always unambiguously positive. And I certainly, as I say, I feel solidarity, and I feel that I have a certain special attention for the plight of people that I know well, that I share these experiences with, and that I have this background in common. But yeah, as I say, I don't like the category of am I proud? I don't know. I'm not. Yeah.
That's really interesting. We're going to talk about your sort of family story and how awfully they were treated by the government of Albania for a very long time. But speaking personally, for instance, during the recent Israel-Iran conflict, I don't feel especially Iranian. I feel British primarily, but I feel attached to Iran through my father. He is Iranian. But during that conflict, I absolutely felt closer to the people of Iran, the language, the culture, the history. And I would use the word pride. I was proud of a people that are able to defend themselves in the face of such overwhelming hostility and aggression with support from the world's most powerful countries. That doesn't mean I agree with everything the Islamic Republic does. Actually, I agree with very little of the things it does. but I would still use the word pride. That's really interesting. Maybe that's a word we can tease out.
There's a kind of linguistic ambiguity there in the way we use it. I absolutely share that. I mean, this is why I said I would single out Albania and Albanians as a place that I think about a lot more than other countries that I could be thinking about. And the people, I feel I know better. I understand certain practices. I'm very fond of certain things. I really miss, Albanian parties, for example, or Albanian ways of socializing in the UK. And there is a way of doing things that is familiar to me, and that is not always the case when in every context. So absolutely, I'd say there are many aspects of that experience that I identify with, an increasing number that I feel solidarity with, many of which I'm fond, but then there's also a lot of other things that I don't like. And I feel like if I had to say I'm proud, I would sort of somehow put a cover on all the negative things and single out all the positives. And I want to retain that ambiguity of that relationship, because I think it's also what makes me a part of this community, is to be able to have that critical stance towards it. Can we have one last sentence about pride? Because this is a kind of interesting question, right?
Yeah.
It made me think. I mean, when I think about the opposite of pride, it's shame, right? And so if you are to ask me, are you ashamed of being Albanian? I say, absolutely not. But this is why I think it's important to not be unambiguously proud, but also to say, this is who I am, and this is how I relate to this experience. And it's neither pride nor shame are relevant categories in this.
A philosopher's answer. You're from Albania. You are somebody who has some sense of belonging to Albanians. Let's not use the word pride. You're also somebody who identifies as being on the left. Would you call yourself a socialist?
Totally, yeah.
Yeah? You'd call yourself a Marxist?
Yeah. I say I don't usually call myself a Marxist. I don't have a problem when people call me a Marxist, so I don't resist that. I don't say, no, I'm not a Marxist. The reason I resist the label, or I don't self-describe as a Marxist, is that I don't like identifying with a person. So for me, if someone is a liberal, they don't say, I'm a Lockean, or I'm a Millian, or I'm a Hayekian. They're a liberal. And liberalism is a tradition which has lots of great thinkers in it, and they have some common themes. And I remember when I was hired at the LSE, I wanted to teach a course that was basically Marx and Marxism and themes around Marxism. And I had offered my colleagues to teach, we had a course called Liberal Theories of Freedom, and I wanted to teach a course called Socialist Theories of Freedom. And I was told, no, the students won't like that course. They want Marx and Marxism. And I inherently, and maybe in part because of my coming from Albania, I don't like these labels that are by names, a Stalinist or a Hoxhaist or a Trotskyist or a Marxist. Or I think there is a socialist tradition to which lots of eminent figures belong, and this is why I prefer the label socialist. But when people say I'm a Marxist, it's fine. I don't mind that. I read Marx. I have lots of things that I enjoy from Marx, other things that I don't agree with. And I feel of socialism is a live tradition that continues to develop. And when we call it Marxism, somehow we're restricting it, or we're just maybe over-determining what it means and how it can be captured.
Althusser had a great line about Marx, which I'm sure you know. He said that Marx discovered a new continent of thinking, like Thales did with mathematics.
Right,
and it's for the rest of us to explore that continent and make sense of it,
right.
which I think is a really beautiful way of...
Yes, absolutely. And I think there is absolutely something to the sort of socialist critique of liberalism and of capitalism that begins to be articulated, and I think has like maybe the clearest in Marx's writing. You get the most powerful origin of that thought. I mean, there were, of course, other currents in socialist thought before Marx, and other thinkers that Marx engaged with that were also part of the tradition. But I agree, there's something to the Marxist critique of capitalism that is very distinctive, and that is still very much worth exploring today and gives us really important categories. But it's also, I agree, a criticism that needs to be developed, because it was written in the 18th century and the world has also moved on since then, and so it's constantly kind of adapting, like every other theory.
So, you're a socialist, you don't mind being called a Marxist, you're Albanian. Now, this is, of course, a country which was experiencing actually existing socialism until very recently, your lifetime. How do your fellow Albanians make sense of that? Do people sort of look at you perplexed and saying, Lea, you're a very successful person, you're Albanian, you've come from a country which tried this, it failed. How on earth could you maintain the same opinions?
Yeah, I think it depends on who they are, really, and what kind of generation they belong to, and what kind of experiences they've had in socialism in Albania. Not all families and not all backgrounds were the same, and not all suffered from the government repercussions in the same way. I would say that, yes, there is a kind of generation of Albanians that came of age that was a little bit older than mine, that so therefore knew much more of socialism in its negative aspects than I did when I was a child. I was 11 when the regime fell. So I don't have actually personally any bad memories from socialist life, but there is a generation of people that was older than me and so clearly experienced repression, censorship, and they are, I suppose, the ones that are the most surprised if of that group of people. Then there's, of course, a category of people that family members or relatives, older relatives, who literally suffered under communism, so went to prison or their grandparents were executed and murdered. And so they are the ones with the sort of greatest resentment and hostility. And then I think there's a generation of younger Albanians, a lot of them also Albanians in the West or immigrants of immigrant families, second generation. I would say they're much more open and much more curious and willing to explore different ways of thinking about socialism. And I think these are the ones with which I understand myself better in dialogue and in conversation because they're a little bit more open-minded. I think there is in general in Albania, but maybe also in other East European countries, there is a tendency to relate to the Marxist tradition as, this is a history that we know, we've tried it, we've failed, it's not worth going there. Just as there is a tendency in the West to think of the Marxist tradition by the left as this is a great philosophy and it needs to be tried and it has never been tried properly. And so in one country, in one context, only the history matters and philosophy is just utopian, doesn't work when you try and realize it in practice. In another context, which is here, only the philosophy matters and then the history is the history of these kind of backward people that tried it and failed for whatever reason, but they never did it properly. I think both of these attitudes are limited and my work is really situated. I'm also situated between those two ways of thinking, trying to both think critically about socialism in Eastern Europe and the experiences of real-world socialism, but also think critically about liberalism and capitalism and current dynamics of globalization, where, as we were saying earlier, there are lessons to be learned from the Marxist critique and need to be adapted. And therefore, I'm also very open to that tradition.
Just to be clear, you said about personal family experiences. Your grandfather was a political prisoner for 15 years, is that correct?
He was a political prisoner, for 15 years. Yes, and on my mother's side, my great-grandfather was killed by the communists. They were property holders, and so their properties were confiscated. They were also elite, wealthy, bourgeois elite in that case. In my father's side, they were more aristocracy and more intellectual elite. But the thing is, just to sort of explain in a way also why my relationship to socialism is so ambiguous, my grandfather was a socialist when he went to prison. He spent 15 years in prison. When he came out, he was still a socialist. He was against capitalism, always reflected critically on what was going on, even when he came out of prison. And he didn't do this just because he was complying with the regime or, because he had to pay lip service to communist Albania. He genuinely saw what was wrong. And my father was the same, genuinely saw what was wrong with capitalism. And I feel that now, he's not there. I've actually not really met him, but I read his notebooks and he used to read and write and has left a number of documents that you can read and he wrote about social theory of heart and he was a sort of engaged intellectual. And I feel as though it would be insulting to that legacy of someone who was a victim of communism but came out and was still a socialist to say that the socialists are only the people who put him in prison. So what about all those other socialists who were victims of Stalinism and of this state socialist project, but also remained critical of capitalism? So for me, it's really important to be able to engage with these experiences. And actually, I think these experiences are not unusual. They're not uncommon. If you think about 1989 and 1990 in Eastern Europe and the dissident movements on Eastern Europe, of course, the story in the West, it's told as a story of they were all free market liberals, they loved the West, they wanted to have jeans and consumption and rock music and so on. But this is not the case. If you read the movements, especially, Havel, the Czech movements, the dissident movements of the 1980s in Poland, in the Czech Republic, in Hungary, an important part of that project was a critique of real socialism, but also a critique of capitalism. So these were democratizing movements that were genuinely trying to find the third way, not the third way of the kind of new labor kind, but a third way that would be able to put together perhaps the more positive aspects of a socialist project, this attention to social justice, or the attention to certain gender questions, or the attention to anti-colonial struggles, with also critique of the lack of democracy and the bureaucratization of the rigid way in which the socialist Stalinist regime, but even just socialist regimes, even after Stalin in the Soviet Union, operated. So I think it's really important to recover that tradition and not to let it be crushed between those two poles. On the one hand, the ones who say, well, socialism is just what real socialism was, Stalinism, and then post-Stalinism, Brezhnev and up to Gorbachev, on the other hand. And, or it's capitalism, it's free markets, it's Hayek. So I think this is where I believe it's really important also for the left to be able to engage and to carve a space between those two poles.
Your grandfather actually knew Hoxha in Paris.
They were in Paris together during the time of the Popular Front, so 1934, 35, 36. These were years in which the socialists and the communists were together fighting the far right, the monarchists, the anti-Semitic right, this beginnings of fascism, obviously, in Europe as well. And at some point, the left won the elections with this prime minister called Léon Blum, and it was a coalition government between the socialists and the communists. So even though my grandfather was a socialist, Hoxha was a communist, they knew each other very well, and at that point, they were on the same side of the struggle.
Did they briefly was staying together? Is that mean miss?
No, the story was that at some point Hoxha was renting a flat in Paris, and he didn't have money to pay the last installment of the rent, and so he had called up all his friends, including my grandfather, to receive his suitcases. So he told the landlady, "I'm going to go in the room and I'm just going to pack and then I'm coming and paying the rent," because he didn't have money to pay. He went and threw out all the suitcases from his window, and then he jumped himself off the window, and his friends kind of received him. And my grandfather was one of the people who was in this group of people, and this is the story that I'm recounting.
And your grandmother met Hoxha.
My grandmother met him in Albania through my grandfather. My grandfather knew him really well from Paris, so they had been hanging out in Paris. And my grandmother met him in the late 1930s, just before the communist resistance movement started in Albania. And he was in the cafes hanging out and was not as involved in Albanian politics as he eventually became with the war.
And that it's really interesting reading, actually, the accounts of what was going on in Albania towards the final years of the Second World War. And I think it's something that barely anyone in Britain even knows about. The violence and the destruction and the just extraordinary intensity of the partisan and resistance movements in southeastern Europe. I mean, in what became sort of Yugoslavia under Tito, but also that part of the world as well. And it's just been erased from history. If you look at, I think, the two countries in terms of per capita casualties from the Second World War, it's the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia.
Yeah.
Huge numbers of people. And that, the Wehrmacht were really screwed because you have this really important path between, the Russian front and sort of what's going on with West Asia and Europe. And you have to go through Yugoslavia. There's Greece as well, of course. And the partisans kind of screw that. And it's just been completely obliterated from our memory of the Second World War and the demise of the German war effort. We don't talk about it. It's like it never happened.
Yeah, and I think, in the Balkans, it's especially complicated because the communist politics is always in a very fraught relationship with nationalist politics, sometimes with progressive nationalism. So the nationalist movement itself, it's split between a more reactive, conservative, fascist side and a more progressive, liberal side. And the communists and the socialists, my grandfather, as I said, was a socialist, but they were trying to navigate this complexity of the war, where on the one hand, it was about securing your state. These were new states, and especially Albania. It's a little bit different from Yugoslavia. Although even there, obviously there's the invasion of Yugoslavia and the breakup, and there is different history of different republics, basically. But it's a really complicated story because these were states that had emerged from the collapse of empires, whose borders were not secure. And therefore, the resistance to fascism and to Nazism was always combined with having to think about where the border is going to be and how is it going to be carved. And this is what makes it really, really complex. And of course, what happened in the Second World War, and actually one of the reasons my grandfather was arrested by the communists later. His official charge was agitation and propaganda and collaboration with British intelligence officers. Now, what happened in Albania during the Second World War? The SOE, the Special Operations Executive, was active in the Balkans trying to encourage anti-fascist resistance. And they didn't really know who was the anti-fascist resistance because they were barely trained, and they didn't really, in terms of understanding the country and the language and the context and the culture and what other struggles had there been. And so they sent these very young, very inexperienced officers who received 2 weeks training in Cairo by an anthropologist who had been following Albanian history and politics for a few decades in the 20s, but that was it, not much more. And then they came and they had to figure out who to support as part of the anti-fascist resistance movement. And the history of the war is very complicated because it changes depending on whether it's the Italians or the Germans in charge. And the Brits, in all this configuration, really complex configuration of forces, decided that the most reliable allies were the communists. Now, the communists were not strong in Albania before the war. There was no communist party. It was only founded in 1941, which is in the middle of the war, basically. Before then, there was nothing. Also because it was a very rural society. There wasn't really a strong working class movement. There were no factories. It was very different context, semi-feudal relations inherited from the Ottoman Empire. And the Brits played a really important role in encouraging the communists, in actually, together with the Yugoslavs. So the communists were influenced both by the Yugoslavs ideologically, but materially, in terms of resources, intelligence, information, it all came via British officers. Now, when the war finished, Hoxha had to jump somehow, and of course he was a communist, so he wasn't going to jump the way of the liberal and the Churchill and the Western side, so he decided to jump with Stalin and Yugoslavs. And so at that point he decided to kick out the British officers and purge anyone who had been somehow in connection with these British officers, including my grandfather. So the reason he went to prison was that he had been in contact with these intelligence British officers with whom Hoxha had also been in contact. But because Hoxha was a communist, he called the shots. And my grandfather was not a communist, was a socialist, could be accused of collaborating with these British officers. I mention this because it's sort of, I've been thinking a lot about questions of historical injustice and how, how these histories change and who you are, how it depends on who your grandfather was and so on. And because I've been thinking, obviously now I live in Britain, so I think a lot about the Second World War also from the perspective of British readers and British history. And of course, the SOE is celebrated for encouraging rightly for encouraging anti-fascist resistance and so on. But if you think about the Balkans, in particular in Albania, it really was like NATO when it left Afghanistan. You have these foreigners who are supporting certain progressive movements, and then they're out, and then the progressive movements are tossed at the mercy of the Talibans. And here they were in Albania, they were supporting these socialists, social democrats, not communists. And then they decided, okay, this is not a priority anymore. The war is over, it's won, and they left. And when I was reading for the book my grandfather's trial documents, the name of some of their British officers came up. So I was Googling them, and then I discovered they were selling luxury villas in Greece, and the families who had kind of inherited property in the area because they clearly had this kind of connection. And I remember thinking, in these exact same years, that these officers who was there talking to my grandfather, who is mentioned in the trial as someone who was encouraging him and with whom he was in contact, in the same years in which my grandfather ended up in this horrible prison in Albania, this other guy, he was in Greece building a swimming pool for his new villa that he's just bought, and no longer thinking about what had happened to these lives.
I suppose there's absolutely that angle, but there is also the aspect to all of this, which is there were people within the SOE and within the British Armed Forces who were communists themselves, yes, and socialists. Yeah. Obviously, you get a pretty left-wing government come to power in 1945. Yeah. Many of the people voting for it are having fought in that conflict. And there's one particular story, I can't remember who it is. It's the brother of a very famous Marxist historian. I think it may be Christopher Hill's brother, it may not be. Who was fighting with Bulgarian partisans against the Wehrmacht, and he was a committed communist, and he refused to basically say that he was British. He refused to because his comrades had been killed, his Bulgarian comrades had been killed, so he died with them. And again, extraordinary story. Yeah. Just like the Spanish Civil War, extraordinary stories of international solidarity, which have been completely erased from the contemporary imaginary, particularly of this country, Britain. Yeah. Which I suppose that was part of a broader project in the 1980s, just to eviscerate any memory of an actual left.
Yeah, and actually that's another reading for why some of these officers, because they had a choice, who to support. Do you support the kind of monarchist-leaning anti-fascist, or do you support the nationalist-leaning anti-fascist? And often it depended on who these intelligence officers were. And sometimes because they were left-wing, often Trotskyists, they supported the communist movements. And this also determined, like the personalities and the histories of these officers determined who the Brits were funding and who they were in touch with. And it's a really interesting story, actually.
Yeah, I've never heard the analogue of Hoxha and the Taliban, but it kind of, as you were talking and before you overtly said that, that's where my mind went. You mentioned about your grandmother. She was born in Salonika. At that time, it was the Ottoman Empire, the tail end of the Ottoman Empire. How big a tragedy was the collapse of the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires for Europe, but also obviously West Asia over the course of the 20th century? Do we underprice how mismanaged the demise of those two empires was?
Yeah. So my grandmother was born in 1918. The Ottoman Empire was still around, but Salonika had at that point become Greek. It was annexed or liberated, however, whichever you ask. If you ask the Greeks, they'll give you one answer. The Turks will give you another answer. But basically in 1912, it became part of Greece. And so my grandmother was born in what was technically Greece, but to an Ottoman family and in a time of great upheaval. And the Ottoman Empire was in its last dying breaths, in a way. So her life was marked by a fundamental shift in management and institutional politics that was very, very different under these new nation states that were emerging from the empires, from the collapse of empires, which had an impact on the people. Now, why did it have an impact? Because Salonika, for example, was a very cosmopolitan city. And the largest group in the city were not Greeks, were Sephardic Jews. So there were Jews, there were Albanians, there were Bulgarians, there were Armenians, there were Turks, there were Greeks, but they were not, by any stretch of imagination, the largest group. So then the Ottoman Empire collapses, and in the process of the collapse, World War I, there is horrible massacres of Armenians, Greeks, Turks in various provinces of the empire. And the collapse of the empire leads to a range of international agreements under the auspices of the League of Nations, which had just emerged to kind of settle and to bring sort of political order to this international mess that World War I had left. And as part of those agreements, the breakup of empires begins to lead to this quest for homogeneous nation states. So the politics of the states that were emerging from the empire was a politics of having to manage very multicultural communities, but now with authorities that were representing one of the groups, not all of them. So all her childhood was marked, and to go back to your question, how big of a change and what happened with the collapse of the empires, this is a very different way of organizing political institutions because it's organized by the nation-state principle. And so self-determination, this idea that, a nation and a state, nations should have their own states. And of course, there's a beginning of what's now called the minority question in international law and efforts to negotiate minority issues with international law. But predominantly, the politics is a kind of nationalist politics that has to manage these new states that emerge from the collapse of empires. And that isn't just the case in the Ottoman Empire, it's also in the Habsburg Empire and in the Russian Empire. So these are all states, new states that emerge from the breakup of these three large empires, which accounts for quite a large part of Europe's population, if you think about Europe in a kind of expansive way that includes the Ottomans and the Russian Empire. My grandmother's life, it's really interesting because when I was a child, I always, we talked about her past, and she always mentioned something that I could not get my head around. She said, my life was ruined by the population exchange. And when you're a child, this concept of a population exchange just doesn't make any sense. How do you get your head around? When I tell my kids now, what is a population exchange? This idea that millions of people were literally exchanged for other millions of people in another country. And there is this territorial principle by which entire groups of people need to comply. And her life was actually, in Salonika, the impact of that was particularly devastating because the population exchange prescribed the return of Greeks of Asia Minor, in particular, and Turks. The Greeks in Turkey had to return to Greece, and Turks of Greece, Muslims, had to return to Turkey. And everyone in between, like the Albanians, who were both Muslim but not Turks, had to decide where to go. And so in her case, in the case of her family, they weren't forced to move by the exchange, but they could decide. And depending on what they decided and what they said their identity was, their entire lives would be different. So the part of her family that actually went to Turkey was fine. The part of the state in Greece did not do as well and eventually had to go to Albania, and that it also determined the rest of her life. So I couldn't quite understand why she said, because, she'd lived through communism and my grandfather had been in prison during communism. She'd had a really hard life. She was a single mother. She went to the countryside to work after having a life of privilege as a young woman. And she always said the greatest disaster was the population exchange. And prison, you understand, as the coercive nature of it and why it might be so hard on an individual. But when you're a child, or a little bit later, not when I was a child, maybe 10, 11, when the regime fell, that she started opening up about her past and the prison histories and so on. When she said the population exchange was really the most horrible thing, I remember thinking to myself, what is a population exchange? And it's only when I wrote the book that I began to sort of go into this question of population exchange and what that meant for people, what it meant institutionally, but also what it meant for everyday lives.
Yeah. And you use that quote from Lord Curzon about unmixing of peoples. So this idea that we start with, and this is obviously the sort of in the mindset of much of the contemporary ultranationalist right, is we had homogenous nations, globalization has mixed people up, and now we need to rectify it. Well, actually, the story is kind of the other way around.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And also, people were always mixed. Even in countries where you think there was a homogeneous nation state, they were also always mixed. But here, what was really interesting is that the unmixing of people was done by international treaty. And so, there's something called the Lausanne Treaty, which was the last treaty to end the Ottoman Empire, which was the one that decided this shift of this population exchange between Greece and Turkey. And the population exchange didn't involve just people, it also involved property. So there's huge bureaucratic documentation. You'd go to an office, it was run by the subcommittees of the League of Nations. So people would literally go to an office and say, we're going to give back this amount of land here, and they would register what they were returning there, and that would go to some refugee family that came from Turkey to Greece, that was given to a Greece family, and they would receive an equivalent, more or less, plot of land in Turkey. And just think about the social lives and, their connections, their human relations. This is just completely all over. And what you have is people just being like sheep, you just take them from one side and move them to another side. And I think it was devastating. It was devastating for my grandmother personally, but also for the city, the city that suddenly has to deal with more than 1 million refugees for Asia Minor who are Greek, but they're not Greek like the other Greeks who have always been in Greece. They're Greeks from Turkey. So they're also not seen as quite the same. Imagine a second generation group here. When I hear the conversations in the right about remigration, there's this term remigration that kind of keeps occurring, which it starts, of course, with we're going to deport illegal migrants and rapists and criminals and so on. And now the discourse has normalized that. So, it becomes mainstream. It's sayable that, you can deport irregular migrants. And then it begins to be, well, maybe you can be a little bit more expansive. And so you start talking about second-generation migrants. Now imagine a second-generation Albanian who's only ever lived in Britain and goes to Albania. Of course, they're not going to feel the same as the other Albanians because they've had a completely different socializing experience. So my grandmother's life was this whole constant trying to renegotiate relationships between these groups. And in her case, she went back to Albania because she felt under pressure in Greece because the new Greek nation state was trying to unmix the people. And so what unmixing meant was that the Albanians of Greece would go to Albania. She went to Albania. She discovered she wasn't like the Albanians of Albania. She was very different. She'd always lived in Greece. And so this is where all the trauma comes from. This is kind of cultural integration, social trauma, but there's all the economic issues of housing, of where you're going to work and where you're going to go to school or how you're going to survive.
Somebody watching this or listening who's from the right, they might say, oh, here we go. The woke talking point from Aaron and Lea, which is that Britain's always been multicultural. Let's be very, very clear. Some countries, some states, some entities, polities have been more, quote unquote, homogenous than others. But if you look at the Austro-Hungarian Empire, if you look at the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, vast swathes of these places were far more diverse than Western Europe is today, than Britain is today. And just to go over.
But also, even Britain had an empire, right?
Well,
so
quite.
This is the other thing. There was a kind of imperial unit.
It's because it was an island. Because it was an island.
Right.
We had it's like the American South. We had those colonies. It just wasn't one contiguous landmass.
Right. So it wasn't territorially continuous. But I was in India over the summer, and there's so much part of the Indian elite and the Indian establishment in the interwar period, or even before that, that was kind of educated in Britain, and it's sort of, you can't say that this is a completely different unit, right? Because it was the same unit, and it's sort of politically it's the same unit. Now, of course, with asymmetries of power and inequalities and injustices and oppression and hierarchies of difference. It matters whether you're a sort of white elite British or whether you're Indian elite, and whether when you're, but it is still the same unit. So this idea that Britain was ever homogeneous, it is a myth as well.
Well, yes and no. So I do think there is a difference in so much as Britain was an island, and you had this cultural, social, political phenomenon elsewhere. So Melbourne and Calcutta are quintessential Victorian cities, right? If you talk about great Victorian cities, you're thinking Manchester, Birmingham, London, Melbourne, Calcutta, right? But I do think that's different to somewhere like, say, the Caucasus, where you've got Armenia, Azerbaijan, you have or Salonika.
Yeah.
I mean, this is really important. 50%
what
of
about
Salonika's...
Ireland, for example, right?
Ireland, of course.
I was just thinking about Marx and Engels when they write about immigration, and when they write about the sort of why immigration is such a fraught topic for them already. Then for the working class movement, how immigration is splitting the working class movement. They mention the example of Irish immigrants, and they say that migration is dividing the working class because the exploited British English worker, when they with their Irish counterpart take the side of the exploiter, and so take the side of capital, because they have this kind of racism that somehow feeds into this hierarchy. So this is just to go back to this idea that I think in the end, with all these histories, when you start scratching a little bit beneath the surface, you discover this much more kind of complicated. And also you discover how minorities get weaponized constantly by some elite or other.
So I agree with all of that. And it's really interesting how the ultranationalists right in this country, they've now decided Irish weren't actually immigrants. Well, if you look at the Times newspaper cartoons of the mid-19th century, they definitely were. They weren't even human a lot of the time. But I do also think that you're talking about the population transfers. Some of the stuff, I mean, this is, this is now a century ago. You talk about the Treaty of Lausanne, and just to be clear, so the Treaty of Lausanne is basically Ataturk gets lots of what he wants. Prior to that is the Treaty of Sèvres, which, is not as advantageous to what became Turkey's interests. But these are these extraordinary post-war documents under international law, doing stuff that I think now we would just be like, what the hell is going on here, right?
Yeah.
And I think another really powerful example for me, you mentioned the population transfers of Greeks and Turks, and there were Greeks in Anatolia for thousands of years, which is just wild. And then you just go, right, new document, you go. Another one is in the Caucasus, in the sort of, I think it was called the Trans-Caucasian Federation, this very short-lived country of Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia, all in one country. And I didn't know this at the time, but Yerevan, which is now the capital of Armenia, I think about a century ago was primarily Azeri, I think. And Tbilisi, which is now the Tbilisi or Tiflis, as it was called, which is now the capital of Georgia, I think that was primarily Armenian, right? And I think, again, I may be wrong, when these countries, when the federation doesn't quite work, you've got these three separate entities declaring independence. I believe they all declare independence from the same city.
Right.
Which, and again, it's just, so this idea that you've got these homogenous peoples and these sort of very clearly demarcated areas is just complete nonsense.
Yeah, no, definitely.
And we're still from Gaza to, Southeastern Europe to, Russia's near abroad to Georgia, etc. We're still living in the shadow of all that stuff.
Yes, and the model that we have for how to create communities, political communities, is always the model of a nation state, right? So the institutional model is still the same model. We're still operating within that framework, and we're thinking about how do they get their independent state, who belongs, who doesn't belong, where do we draw the boundary, how do we go about? And it's interesting that when those international frameworks were adopted within the League of Nations, part of the rationale for them was that if there was no international framework, if there was no kind of legally prescribed account or arrangement for how you would manage these issues, there would be genocide. And so this is also some of my characters in the book, they have this in their conversations. One of them is saying, well, we had the empire, that was a framework. And another character says, yeah, but the empire is gone. And these gentlemen from the League of Nations said there would have been genocide between the Greeks and the Turks if you didn't stop this somehow and you didn't have what they call a settled agreement and a settled framework. And the settled framework is literally packing up people and saying, you're on this side, and you don't mix, and you have your own state, you have your own state. And that was not how the empire operated. Now, of course, the empire had its own, I don't want to idealize realize. And, we mustn't be romantic about empires either, because although at one level they were more tolerant of minorities and cultural groups, and they have their own tribunals, and they settle disputes in very different ways. In the Ottoman Empire, you had the millet system. Of course, it was a site of hierarchy and, gender oppression and racial hierarchies still. And so it's not that it was all great. But it was, as I said, it was a framework as well. And now you can think about which framework are you going to democratize? And why is it that we decided to democratize the nation state, or to democratize via the nation state, as opposed to thinking about this in a slightly different way? It's a really interesting question, which I have not answered yet. But this is what sort of completely fascinates me. Like, can you think of how you could have... And I think there were some projects, partly why I'm really interested in Austro-Marxism, because they had these projects of what they call the kind of non-territorial political community, where you worked with diasporas that were non-territorial, and following a little bit, most of them came from the Habsburg Empire. So these were Austrian and Bohemian Marxists who were thinking about this along very different lines from Lenin, who had a more like self-determination principle that was more like Wilson. But and they were thinking about it like that because they were within the Habsburg framework. And so they were trying to think about how could you democratize the empire, and how could you think about diaspora arrangements. And so there were some elements also in the Marxist tradition, actually, of thought from which you could think about transnational units. But they've now mostly forgotten characters, and a lot of their work is not really translated from German. But there, I think, is really interesting thought from this interwar period that one could go back to.
I mean, two of the best books I've read in recent years are Joseph Roth, The Radetzky March.
Yeah, of course.
And Stefan Zweig, Memoir
yeah.
of a European.
Yeah.
And I know we're trying to problematize the state, the nation state, without saying empires are good, which we're not saying that. But with Stefan Zweig, there is definitely the sense of, okay, what comes after the Austro-Hungarian Empire was definitely a downgrade.
Yeah, of course.
In terms of civil liberties, in terms of meritocracy, etc., however you want to measure it, because it's replaced by an Austrian state, which ultimately joins the Third Reich with Anschluss.
Yeah, of course. And in Radetzky, you have this very final pages of it. It's such an amazing book of the Radetzky March, which is in if I remember it correctly, around the Ukrainian border, and where all this you were in the same military unit, and then suddenly these soldiers were all fighting for the Kaiser. Then they decide that suddenly the world is changing, and the First World War is about to start, and they all discover the nation that they're from. And you begin to see how epistemological frameworks change once the world begins to move in a different direction. Yeah, those are both really amazing books, actually, for that reason that you just said. Yeah.
And people talk about Europeans and Western values and Western civilization. I think like the apotheosis of European culture probably is Vienna. Before the First World War, full of Jews, the heart. I think at one point you had Lenin, Freud, and was it Einstein?
Yeah, they were all around there. Trotsky was around.
Trotsky.
It was like, they were all in the same cafe in Vienna.
And people say, something like Peter Hitchens would say that Europe committed suicide with World War I. But I think, there's probably an argument it committed suicide as well with these treaties you're referring to.
There is, of course, yes, there is an argument that those, but again, it's really hard to know how you would negotiate the end of World War I, right? Other than by these treaties. So it's sort of interesting counterfactual question. I think for me, the question is not so much like, what would you have done? Maybe were they wrong or were they right? Because that's kind of neither here nor there. It's more about what conceptual space does it open for us now when we're thinking about how to think about minority questions or disputes between different groups and this obsession that we have that, if everyone has their own state, it'll be fine. And maybe, multinational states are also a different framework, but also worth thinking about. I mean, just think about Middle Eastern now, for example. It's unsayable to say that you always think about two-state solution. So two-state solution is one solution, but another solution is to have a multinational, one kind of collective common space where everyone negotiates and sort of lives together peacefully in a more multicultural form. So one could be like, I don't know, French and English speakers in Canada. That's also a model, right? So, but these things have now become unsayable because I think the dominant model is the nation state.
Ilan Pappé's, I think, trying to say something quite similar. He thinks ultimately the state of Israel will fail because of it's becoming two countries, two peoples, which is the state of Israel and the state of Judea, liberal Zionism, and this, which he's not defending, but it's very different to what settler colonialism, which Israel's founded on that. In the West Bank, these illegal settlements, ultra-religious Haredim, etc., they have completely conflicting cultural, political attitudes to the liberal Zionists who founded the State of Israel. And he thinks, as that fails, I think that's going to have to create a space for the conversations you're talking about, which is, multinational states. And I think I meet so many Turks who say, you know what, the Ottoman Empire was probably a better way of doing things than Turkey, if you look at what then subsequently happens, and to this day is happening. We could talk about this for a long period of time. One of the reasons why I defend Iran as it is, and I will happily go on record and say I defend Iran, is because I think there's a long-term project by the State of Israel to basically balkanize Iran because of geopolitical interests. Iran is 1/3 Turkish speaking, has Armenian speakers, it has Arab speakers in Khuzestan, Luristan, has Baluchi speakers, and it hasn't quite caught up with the Europe of the 1920s and the 1930s. It wasn't balkanized in that way. And that's something I would want to defend, the idea that, Iranian Azeris want their own state, which is a bit of a talking point from some people in the foreign policy establishment. Well, my dad's Iranian Azeri. No, they don't. They don't want that crap coming to their country. Anyway, you are one of the most high-profile, if not the most high-profile Albanian in the UK. I could say Dua Lipa, but she's Kosovo Albanian.
Yes, you're right, yeah. But still, yeah, okay, they also call themselves Albanians.
That's true, okay. But I think, there's just slightly, because she has Kosovo citizenship
and Albanian
right?
citizenship,
yeah.
Both. She has both.
Yeah.
Yeah, but she's Kosovo born.
But after Dua Lipa,
right?
You're one of the more famous ones, right? What's it like for Albanians living in the UK right now? And we talked about how hard it's been for your brother and your mum, but in the last 5 years, what's changed?
Well, there is obviously a project that has been going on for a really long time in this country of scapegoating minorities and trying to blame on various minority groups the sort of failures of neoliberalism and of globalization with all its repercussions on various categories of people. And I think Albanians are just the latest victim of that project. I don't think there's anything special about Albanians. And now they get talked a lot about, if you read the media, it'll be about the prison population of Britain and how many Albanians there are. You'll be hearing about Albanian small boats crossing and illegals and so on. But of course, the project of kind of scapegoating didn't start with Albanians, and it's not going to end with Albanians. I lived in Italy in the 90s, and it was just the same. So somehow, unfortunately, I have this kind of tragic thing where whichever country I move, suddenly there is a kind of wave of anti-Albanian sentiment. In Italy, it was just as horrible in the 90s. There were these waves of emigration from Albania to Italy. And I remember this very well because I had a friend who was a journalist, and she said she'd call the police to report a crime. And so she'd find out from the police that there was a crime. And they didn't immediately say who the crime was committed or who the suspect was. And she said she always had to ask them because her newsroom was not interested if it was not an Albanian. So she was the intermediary between the sort of newsroom and the police station. And so then she called her editor and said there was a crime, and if it wasn't an Albanian, they wouldn't write about it. And this story stayed with me. This was a university student who had then gone into journalism. And I think it's the same, when you read now the sort of mainstream or I don't want to name newspapers, but basically there is a narrative about Albanians and how they want to come and stay and how they're all involved in the drug gangs and and of course, Albanians, there's 140,000 Albanians in the UK. Of course, they're not 140,000 drug smugglers. As I said earlier, it's impossible for an Albanian young man to get a visa. So the most obvious answer to when I get asked, why do Albanians cross the border illegally? I'm like, well, you give them a visa and then they won't cross illegally. They'll cross legally. If they cross illegally, it's because they have family in the UK and they want to join and they've been told there's a job. There is shortage of skills in this country in a number of sectors, including the construction sector, where there's a lot of Albanian businesses and stuff. So there is a diaspora that is, and a community of Albanians that's diverse and employed in various parts of society, some academics, some doctors, some nurses, some builders, and then, of course, also some drug smugglers. But the narrative is very much one of demonizing the community. But as I say, I don't think there's anything specific about Albanians. It just so happens that this is the easiest target for now. And if it were not Albanians, it would be someone else. And because this is just how mainstream right-wing scapegoating works. And this is how it worked in the 1920s and 30s as well. Back then it was the Jews and the Albanians and the Armenians.
Do you think we're going back to the 1920s?
Yes and no. We never go back to exactly the same thing. I think we can see some of the same dynamics. So I'd say there are some trends that we can detect, the crisis of globalization and the breakup of international multilateral institutions, there is a parallel between, for example, the crisis in the 90s in Europe, in the Western world. There was this moment of heightened international cooperation in transnational institutions that were beginning to develop, that began to have quite an impact on the life of states, and free trade agreements, sort of reduction of barriers and so on. And I think this has some parallel to the time in which the League of Nations was the institution under which many of these, both free trade, but a number of policies were being coordinated, which wasn't just security-based policies, but there was some sense of international framework for cooperation in that case. And of course, that was all ended by the Wall Street crash by 1929 financial crisis. So that was one aspect. 2008, 2009 financial crisis, there's some overlap between this end of this kind of globalization capital moment. I'd say the second one is the rise of the far right. But before even the rise of the far right, the beginnings of these projects of persecution or reduction of spaces for minorities. So before it becomes a far right or a fascist question, it's a question of reduction of rights for or loss of multiculturalism as a project. Now, of course, in the 20s and 30s, there wasn't really multiculturalism in the way in which we know it. But some of the questions that people were raising were similar. For example, I remember when I was reading about the Popular Front in France in the 30s and why were these leftists protesting and what were the issues. One of them was that Jewish people were being given access to professions of doctors and nurses, for example. And a lot of French people manipulated by the far right were saying, why are these professions open to Jewish people? We want them to restrict them to Jewish people so that French people can have access, so that we can kind of... And this was one of the things that my grandfather in the Popular Front was protesting about and fighting, and that was a big question. And of course, it reminded me of a number of, for example, when Marine Le Pen a couple of years ago was saying how we can restrict access to the state offices for immigrants or people with immigrant background. There are certain professions that shouldn't be accessible to them. That was the clearest parallel because it was France. It was France 2 years ago versus France in the 1930s. But there was certainly this project of thinking about how minorities might be an issue and that the problems of society get solved if they turn into homogeneous society with rights, rights for France for the French and so those two are, I think, connected. The third one that is becoming, to me, also increasingly similar. First, this move which is connected to the financial crisis, the raise of tariffs and protectionism. But on the other hand, also alongside that, defense and defense spending. So at some point in the 30s, you begin to see real investment in arms race. And of course, you produce, this is another character in my book that says, if you produce a lot of arms, if you see now the charts of which industries are doing well in the world, the ones that are really skyrocketed in terms of their shares and so on, it's usually arms-based interest. And of course, now it comes with new technologies and so on. But, if you have this arms race, there is a real risk that there will be used at some point. And if you have a discourse that heightened conflicts in society between groups, also war becomes a catalyst for that. So the reason the Second World War becomes a catalyst of a number of things that have been going on is that the territory is ready. You have minorities groups fighting each other, and you have weapons, and you have states increasingly in conflict, breakup of international institutions and frameworks of agreement. So I think there are a lot of parallels, but of course it's not the same thing. We're in a different period. And the other one that I would say, the last one, which also had a real impact, and maybe this is talked about less when people compare to the 30s and 40s, was actually the impact of the radio in the spread of fascism. And when you think about new technologies, when you think about new technologies now, and in what way do social media influence radicalization, there was an argument that, had to do with the force of the voice of Hitler or Mussolini and the cinema in, people just having this direct, or what they thought was direct communication, direct access with these leaders, and the way in which charismatic or discussions around charisma and personality entered the realm of political discussion. I think there is also something like that with the way in which news cycles are produced, and accessibility and proximity to listeners, which this was also a moment of kind of technological revolution, because this was sound and images which hadn't been there before. And I think we now obviously have new social media and internet digital circulation, which is very different, but has some parallel in terms of there's this kind of revolution in information spreading. And I'd say that's the other aspect that's also worth thinking about.
I say this on a YouTube interview, but I think TV was a huge mistake. Neil Postman, this great media scholar, he talks about, somebody like Abraham Lincoln simply would not reach high office in a world of television.
Right.
And he talks about the debates, presidential debates in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, 1830s, 40s and 50s, I should say. And, if you read them, these politicians are thinking and speaking in whole paragraphs. And it's just a world away from where we are now and where we're moving to, which is basically 1 minute clips and reels, which, I mean, implicitly you're saying is buttressing these ultra-nationalist and far-right arguments.
Yeah, although I think, we could have a whole podcast on this just to discuss this issue. Of course, and now we can stick to the comparison with radio and television, for example. There's also kind of democratizing aspect, right? Because not everyone has the same skills and not everyone can read long paragraphs and read the newspapers and have the same kind of... And there is something that if news are more accessible, more easily, circulate more easily, everyone can participate. There is a sort of way in which the public sphere changes that might also be conducive to promoting democracy. So actually my take on new technologies is that this is like a kitchen knife. You can have a kitchen knife and use it to slice bread and have a nice picnic, or you can use it to kill your fellow human being. And it's not about the kitchen knife. It's about the use of it. Who controls it? Who produces it? Who sells it? How they sell it? What discourse there is around it? How it gets framed? And this technology is the same thing. I don't think technology is inherently good or bad. I think humans are good or bad, and the purposes they have are good or bad. But I don't think there's any. But yeah, we could have like a really long debate about this. It's a very interesting question. Yeah,
like the novel. If you think about the whole point of the novel. Who is it? Stendhal has a great line about the novel. He says, the point of a novel is the bow and the violin is your soul. And each novel plays your soul differently. Forster has another great line as well about novels. He says that, it allows you to see the world through it. And this is a hackneyed sort of cliche, but he says it in a really, really compelling way in aspects of the novel. It allows you to see the world through a second set of eyes in a second way, and it's a gift. And I buy the argument that as a technological innovation with mass literacy, with the printing press, that fundamentally alters something in human consciousness after the 1600s, and of course the novel, hand in hand with the Industrial Revolution and mass literacy, changes a lot. And I think that has a massive impact on the human psyche and on society and on politics. And I think that the move to a post-literary society is going to create really ugly things. Really, I think even the very essence of universalism obviously goes hand in hand with the rise of Christianity. So the idea that there's a universal humanity is a very old idea. But as a popular idea that you can access for yourself, I think that goes hand in hand with the rise of the novel. And I sort of think it's disappearing. I mean, I could be wrong. Marx was good on this, right? He said, I don't like the bourgeois economists. Loads of them talk loads of shit. But he loved his bourgeois novelists.
Yeah, no, of course. But I guess my point is more narrow. It's more that these are tools. Technology is a tool, just like every other tool. You can use it in one way and you can use it in another. It's not the tool that we blame. And so people, when they say, oh, it's the media or it's the new technology, no, it's who controls the media, how it circulates, what discourse is framed, the use of it. And there could be a positive use. I'm not saying, if it substitutes and it leads to the kind of eradication of other types of communication, or so if it completely leads to suppression of knowledge and suppression of culture. But I don't think, cultural innovations need to cancel each other out. They can be layered and they can kind of, humans can handle an amazing amount of complexity, and all of these things can be there, and the plural spaces, and there's a space for the real and there's a space for the novel, and it's more about how you actually organize cultural production and what projects there are and what discourses there are that enable us to not just suppress one and have the other. And I think for me the problem is actually more capitalism than the tools that we use, because it's more about what incentives there are to bring culture in a certain direction and what role the profit motive plays, and why this kind of likes and clicks and shares makes us enter a world that is very dangerous because it cannot be controlled anymore. It's just the profit motive that more or less controls everything without even being conscious of that control. Yeah, and I think this is also why it's kind of the greatest insights of Marxist tradition is that nobody needs to be responsible in capitalism for certain things. There doesn't have to be one agent that oppresses another agent. Every single agent within their social role does what they are meant to do within that system to continue to perform that social role. And then some social roles lead to exploiters and some other social roles leads to exploited people. And a capitalist doesn't need to be wanting to harm the worker. Of course, they end up harming worker, but they don't have to want to do that. And it's irrelevant, whether they're nice or not nice or what they think about it. So. And I think this is one of the greatest insights actually in the critique of capitalism, is that it's not about identifying individual agents. It's more about thinking about the patterns of the structure, and that structural critique leads to a more, hopefully, productive way of thinking about society. And
Well, quickly on this, I mean, I agree with you on that. You know, the impetus clearly for the very short reel is about our attention spans and generating profits from shortening attention spans and maximizing profitability with regards to ad revenues, etc.
Right.
So I agree with you on that. And also on Marx, again, for people watching this, and I want lots of people to watch our videos and listen to the podcast who've never engaged with these ideas before, what you're saying is that within capitalism, you have this iron law of competition and seeking profit. And if you're not competitive, you will no longer be a capitalist, you'll be a worker. And that's the worst thing in the world, because you have to sell your labor. And so, our agency within that is all sort of limited. So you see parallels with the 1920s and the 1930s. We're talking about large populations being moved after the collapse of an empire, Ottoman Empire, Russian Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire. I wonder, could we say there may be a parallel if the project of the European Union collapses? That we might see something similar about large-scale, because you used that word remigration, which is now being used by lots of the European far right, and a lot of them aren't Europhiles, it should be said. Is that a parallel that's possible, do you think?
I think it's actually somehow more complicated with the European Union, because the European Union is an unfinished project. So it's not that there is a kind of institutionally settled idea of what the EU is, and it's constant in part because of how the EU was created, how it operates, because of functionalism and so on. And I think the EU is very much a project that can go in one way or in another way, very much depending also on who is politically and culturally hegemonic within the EU, and so who is in many ways kind of calling the shots within the institutions, and what is the kind of driving narrative. So I think there were moments of the development of European institutions where the progressives, maybe more kind of cosmopolitan-minded, but also more socially minded, because the EU was born as a kind of neoliberal project, but there were within the EU critics that said, no, but let's have more, social justice, and let's think about citizenship in the EU as a vehicle of emancipation. Those voices are now completely marginalized and very, very more or less irrelevant, basically. Voices that say, let's reform the EU, let's sort of think about transnationalism, and let's think about exactly going back to these ideas of federation or multicultural structures or multi-layered levels of exercise of authority. These debates were very much live. I did my PhD at the European University Institute, which is where all the kind of bureaucrats were coming to do their PhDs, and people were talking about the European demos and the demos debate and the democratic deficit of the European institutions and how you could compensate for that democratic deficit. There was a kind of progressive criticism of the EU that said, let's try and revise the treaties so that they can be more amenable to social justice questions. That is all more or less dead now. And actually the forces that are driving the debate are the nationalist forces. So if you think, and if you look at for example, the speeches of Giorgia Meloni, who is, and Viktor Orban for that matter. So these are right-wing actors who have a very, very coherent nationalist narrative. But Meloni in particular has realized that if she only talks about Italy, of course, when she talks about Italy, she always talks about the nation. Have you ever heard her say the state? She will always say la nostra nazione. And the nation is inherently exclusive, right? And she is not stupid in using the word. She knows who she's speaking to when she says la nostra nazione, right? However, when she speaks in kind of EU levels, she presents this vision of the EU as a kind of large nation of civilized European countries, more or less, which is very much a Christian. She says it's Christian. Of course, it's also a progressive Christianity, so I don't want to be misunderstood here. It's a very complicated discussion. But the way she uses it is very much anti-Islamic, very much sort of talking about Christianity as the emancipating force of European civilization. She will talk about European civilization, and she presents a project of reform of the European institution that tries to turn Europe into this kind of larger white civilizing force, where therefore the unit is not just Italy, it's the whole of Europe, or at least European Union member states. But with all the tensions of first making sure that we unmix the peoples and we got rid of the elements in our society that might be a problem for that integration, because, it may turn out that Muslims have certain practices that are regressive and that other groups have other practices that we don't like. And so we just kind of stick to our core white civilized, which is, of course, it's obviously ridiculous if you think about the history of Europe and its relationship to the rest of the world and to colonialism and imperialism and so on. But just at the level of this discourse, I think it's internally very coherent. It's driving forward a right-wing reading of the EU, which tries to turn it into a nationalist superstate, the core idea of which is European civilization. I don't know, Charlemagne, or some sense of Europe against the barbarians, basically. And this is every speech she gives. She presents this view of Europe, of Christianity, of European values. There's no sense of reflection critically on what these European values have done when they were transplanted to other parts of the world. What did Europeans also? What were they responsible for in previous centuries? How actually the biggest horrors of Second World War happened in Europe. And, it's not like they happened in some strange other part of the world, in this continent. So there's no reflection. There's completely eradication of those more problematic, critical aspects of history and a vision of the European Union as a right-wing vision. And I'm afraid that vision is becoming more and more hegemonic and people are following it.
So you think that's the sort of the rightward drift of Europe is via the European Union rather than the European Union breaking down, the Eurozone breaking down? Because when I look at, for instance, the demise of the Eastern Bloc in the late 1980s, 1987, nobody in West Germany thought East Germany was going to collapse. And I wonder, there could be, and I don't think this, by the way, I sound like I'm ventriloquizing Nigel Farage, but it could be that the Eurozone doesn't work. All it takes is France or Italy to pull out for whatever reason, and that will really screw it quite badly. And at which point the whole European project looks very fragile, because it is fragile. Empires can be fragile. They can just disintegrate very quickly. And then that would look quite ugly quite quickly. But you're saying actually the vector for European ultranationalism is very different to that.
I mean, these two are, so the way I read it, I don't see a lot of criticism of Europe on this kind of financial, political economy level, right? I mean, maybe there are moves in that direction. This is not what the discourse is. My impression is that what they're going to try and do is to kind of use the EU to culturalize it and to turn it into a kind of actor that can play a certain role in suppressing immigration, in destroying multiculturalism, in unraveling whatever idea of a supranational European citizenship the EU might have channeled at one point or other of its history. Because the EU is very different, lots of different things. You can't really capture it very easily. But because it's lots of different things, there are lots of different political projects within the discussion around European institutions. So, for me, the EU will become much more fortress Europe, anti-immigration, a place where you coordinate migration policy, where you coordinate exclusion, where the framework of cooperation that the EU enables will not be a framework of cooperation that actually promotes social justice, but will be one that is just used in this kind of anti-immigration, anti-minority, often Islamophobic direction. And this is where I think you can see, what kind of initiatives do they propose? It's initiatives to revise migration law or international human rights law when it has implications on migration. She's trying to promote the deals of the kind that she made with the Albanian government to make sure that you can get around international norms and conventions to deport migrants to third states. And she's trying to bring that at the EU level because it doesn't really work at the state-to-state level. She's having lots of trouble with, I'm just talking about Meloni because it's a good example. I mean, all the far-right leaders are doing the same in all the different countries. She's using that, she's having trouble with the courts in Italy, and because there is a European human rights framework and international conventions and international human rights agreements that make it very difficult for Italy to just do what the right would like to do, which is to deport all the time. And so what she's trying to do is to change all these treaties and conventions in a direction that is more compatible with her project, that makes it the same norm for all countries. They can all deport, they can all revise international convention. I think it's going to be this taking advantage of supranational structures and rules to try and use them for right-wing projects that are of this anti-immigration kind.
I suppose when you've got a club of so many countries, though, it's like you said, it's going to mean so many different things, so many different people. I mean, was it Roberto Fico? Is he the Slovakian PM? He was in China at this, this big military parade. And at the same time, you've got something like Kaja Kallas, who I have zero time for, a former Estonian PM, saying that, we're an existential challenge from China. So, it's an interesting one.
I mean, I think you're right. There are different countries and different states. But then on the other hand, if you get the same kind of politics in each of these states, then they become much more homogeneous, right? So all you need is, and this is why it's also a lesson for the left. Sometimes look really hard, like what do you do to get progressive forces in place? Well, in each of these countries, you need to have a kind of narrative that is similar and that mobilizes voters and mobilizes the public and brings together a kind of social change. And that needs to happen in a number of key states. Doesn't even have to be in every state, because there's also a cascade effect. The smaller states are much more influenced by larger states. Not like, it doesn't really matter what Albania thinks. I mean, Albania is not even in the EU, so it really doesn't matter. But yeah, it just, I don't know. It doesn't matter what Estonia thinks. In the end, it matters what Germany, what France, what Italy, what the big players think. And then there's a kind of cascade effect on the smaller states.
That's what made me excited about Mélenchon, Corbyn and Sanders. You know, there's an alternative, not that, again, there's three old white men. But, you know, there's an alternate universe. If you play that situation out 25 times, Mélenchon is the president of the French Republic, Corbyn's prime minister, Sanders is the president of the United States. I mean, that would just be such a massive reset. And we weren't a million miles away from it, right? In recent history. You're somebody who's obviously politically minded, although you're a philosopher by training. You know, you have a lot to say about current affairs. Do you think that Keir Starmer, as Prime Minister of the UK, is handing power on a platter to Nigel Farage?
So, okay, I don't like to talk about Starmer and Farage, so about individuals. I think we're in a moment in political history where the left and left forces are just not there, and the center left is completely chasing the narrative of the right, because it actually doesn't have its own category, it doesn't have its own critical reading of society, and we can talk about that in a minute, so this kind of larger level. And of course, you know, Starmer and Farage are just the puppets of this, you know, they're just, it doesn't matter if it wasn't Starmer, it would be someone else. The dynamic is similar, because I think the dynamic, you can see it repeats itself in a number of contexts in a number of countries in Europe. There's the center left that is completely unable to articulate a vision of society that is a very different one from the right. The script is of the right. The script is one that says, the problem is one of belonging. The problems of civilization, the problems of society, the problems of globalization are problems of membership. If we solve the question of membership, we have solved the problems of society. And therefore, you know, identity is the key to reading all the conflicts of today. So if we just figure out who is in and who is out, who belongs and who doesn't belong, then we'll have fixed it. So this is a story of the right. It has always been about membership, about identity, about how you think about who is in and who is out. And the left traditionally has had a different reading of globalization, because it was more about, you know, different categories, modes of production, capitalism, how economic and political factors come together. Unfortunately, for a series of reasons that we could spend a lot of time discussing, the left has abandoned that narrative and that type of criticism of society. So it's also into a discussion that thinks about, for example, progress through the law, the rule of law, and progress through rights claims, and doesn't really think about other categories through which you could organize political conflict, like class, for example, which is a transnational category. So I think if you don't have a kind of vision of society that is a really different vision, and a different vision means a different diagnosis of what's wrong, and a different set of policy proposals, and a different narrative of how you could solve what's wrong. So the narrative is one that is given by the right. The solutions are given by the right. The solutions are about membership, who belongs, who doesn't belong, which identity group is here, who deserves, who doesn't deserve. And the left is tweaking with the angles, with sort of tweaking with the minor details of that discourse. But the discourse is not going to change. And this is why I started by saying I'm a bit reluctant to speak of Starmer and Farage, because they are entering a broader picture in which this is happening everywhere. And it's not just about the individuals. Now, of course, different individuals might do this better. I'd be really interesting to see, in my reading of European politics, the only party on the left that is trying to at least hold a little bit off that narrative is Sanchez and the Spanish socialists and kind of Spain.
Yeah.
So you can see that it is possible to. I'd be really interesting to see how it develops and how the Spanish socialists continue to do in the next elections, for example, and if they're having all kinds of internal domestic issues, which maybe we hear less about, but might also bring them. I'm really sort of watching to see what's going on, but I think they are the only exception to this, what seems to be otherwise a very well consolidated trend. And yeah, sure. So I think there is a real risk that in the next election, the Labour Party will be wiped out.
And who replaces them?
I'm not good with predictions. Actually, I don't even like to make predictions.
I don't believe that. I don't. Actually, you're so thoughtful. I don't think that's true.
Yeah, I don't think, and I think academics, when they make predictions, are terrible. I'd say the best case scenario is going to be a hung parliament. But it's too early to say.
Of course.
So it's also all sort of changing, all in flux. There's different interesting things happening on the Greens, on the new party, Corbyn Sultana project. So there are some sort of things moving in the also in the British political landscape. So I think it's really too early to speak about the elections.
People are really underpricing the possibility of a hung parliament, but the Lib Dems and Labour having by far the most seats. I think people are really underpricing that. Like, I think Reform will be the biggest party, but the Lib Dems are going to do tremendously well.
Yeah, the Lib Dems have done recently. Yeah, I mean, they seem to be one of the positions they've been taken. They've clearly had a clear profile and clear messaging. And so, yeah, they're probably going to do better than last time. It's not very hard.
You said that the right basically says that questions of identity, who's in and who's out, will basically solve everything. And you've just captured there something I've been thinking about for so long. You know, I was posting when I was in Malta recently. My wife's family's from Malta. Lovely, you know, masonry on the floor and the stones look great. And I'm saying, oh, they haven't yet found the wonders of outsourcing where there'd be graffiti everywhere and all the stones would mismatch, because that's how it looks in Britain. There'd be rubbish everywhere. And then one of the replies said, well, that's because they don't have refugees. And of course, Malta per capita has about 8 times more refugees than Britain does. And they really do. And this is the remarkable thing for me, because I try to be charitable with people who disagree, and often rightly so. They're very clever. They think about things. They're no less intelligent than me. Often I'm less intelligent than they are. But for lots of these people, they genuinely seem to believe that every single problem in Britain right now, from, the trains not working to litter being on the streets to antisocial behaviour to the housing crisis, if you're migrants, not even, they say refugees, then it will be sorted. And I'm thinking, well, I'm from Bournemouth, and in Bournemouth there's a guy called Dave Wells. He's a slum landlord. Him and his family have about 2,000 properties, and they're all in awful condition. And it leads to broken homes, it leads to bad communities. The people who are owner-occupiers who live next door to these properties, they're not happy either. What's that got to do with refugees? But they don't, like you say, it doesn't really register for them. And it really is incredible how seemingly intelligent people can just...
Well, I mean, think about, is this other, for example, I've been thinking a lot after the American election, it's complete paradox, right? That an American warehouse worker, a white American warehouse worker who is in some kind of completely exploited condition in an Amazon warehouse in the US, how they can think that they actually have much more in common with Jeff Bezos than with the immigrant worker that is next to them. And this for me signals the fact that there is an absence of discourse of being able to articulate conflicts along different lines. And the old Marxist concept would have been class, right? So you would have said, you and I, we are both exploited, and the problem is the people at the top who have money and wealth and capital and who have certain incentives to work in a certain way and have an incentive to exploit both of us. Now, if there is not that reading in society is not there, because actually even on the radical left, I'm not really sure how much this gets problematized and how much migration is spoken of in those terms. And migration isn't really, I don't think even when it's mentioned as a problem, no one talks about migration as a question of social class, when it's so obvious that it's a question of social class, right? Think about other example that I've also was really troubled by. In the same week in which Donald Trump was posting videos of immigrants in shackles going on these boarding flights that were like properly horrifying, shocking images, in that same week he announced golden visas, investor visas for oligarchs, right? So clearly they know, I don't know if they know, clearly the problem is not about who speaks English and who doesn't, and who belongs and who doesn't. Because if it was about who belongs and who doesn't in terms of culture, surely the restrictions should be the same for everyone. You wouldn't say the Arab oligarch is fine, but the Arab who is in a neighborhood that is deprived and so is a problem because it's an Arab. If the problem is being Arab, then it's whether you're rich or whether you're poor, it doesn't matter. But you have this kind of, and the right is championing its migration policies. Malta is a very good example of how they were selling investor visas and selling passports. And so we're in an age of completely restricted citizenship for the poor. So you have means tested. You don't get citizenship very easily. You have income requirements on integration. You have real difficulties if you're workers in Albania to get a visa. And so also completely restricted citizenship for the poor and completely open borders for the rich. And it's really not about culture, it's about class. So why does the left is not able to actually articulate a criticism of globalization and on society that says, yeah, sure, let's talk about migration. You want to talk about migration? Let's talk about migration. Let's talk about the oligarchs. Let's talk about what they're doing to housing in London or anywhere. Let's talk about how people are excluded. And let's also talk about how citizenship, which used to be, even if you're thinking as a kind of democratic nationalist or a progressive, someone who is not, into cosmopolitanism, multiculturalism, citizenship used to be a vehicle of social inclusion and enfranchisement and progress, right? And it was that when it was no longer taking property and census lines. So it was in the beginning, in the 19th century, was citizenship only for the rich. Workers couldn't vote. People who couldn't read and write couldn't vote. They didn't have political rights. And then it became universal. So citizenship has returned to being exactly that, because it's basically whoever is rich can purchase it. Doesn't matter where they are. They can come from wherever they are and get a passport and get accelerated visa procedures. They can have the Home Office come to your house and take the fingerprints if you pay the right fee. Or they can be completely denied inclusion, even if they've been already living in the country for like 20 years if they don't have the right amount of money. So you're returning to this dynamic of citizenship that is just sold and bought like any other commodity. And that returns us to the days where citizenship was basically a good that was bought and sold and was restricted by property. And one of the kind of biggest conquests of the democratic movement in the stages where it was going well was to say, well, let's make citizenship universal and let's not make it income dependent. So why is it that the left is unable to have this discourse on migration and citizenship that puts the finger on where the problem is?
So I'm a big fan of the green card. It's quite a democratic thing, I quite like this country to have a green card system. I suppose I would add to that, you have people like, I shouldn't really say names, because you're so diplomatic and nice. Somebody like Isabel Oakeshott will be talking about the problem of Muslim migrants to Britain, or Richard Tice, her partner. And I'm not suggesting they're Islamophobic, but they might be highlighting certain people coming to the UK from certain countries. And then I'm thinking, lady, you moved to Dubai. So clearly, like you say, you obviously don't think culture is the problem. Otherwise, you wouldn't be living in Dubai. You don't think Arabs are the problem. But it's certain kinds of Arabs, certain kinds of Muslims, and those certain kinds of people come from lower classes or, more economically deprived or less privileged backgrounds.
But why? So then you have to, last line on this, then you also have to ask the question, why is that? Because when people have no rights, so when working class people, migrants with no papers, no legal protection, when they have no rights, they're much more easy to exploit. So they can't be part of unions, they can't protest, they're much more easy to kind of threaten and to coerce so they just can be exploited more easily. So it's actually in the interest of capital to have people who have no rights, and it's in the interest of capital and the circulation of capital to be able to exploit people without rights.
Yeah. Well, I think, my colleague Ash Sarkar said this before, there's an interpretation, for instance, of undocumented migrants in this country working for the likes of Uber Eats, Deliveroo, etc. I think these companies kind of like that setup, actually. They kind of like it.
Of course, yeah.
Because if they were legally here, legally able to work, they would have a lot more leverage, easier to unionize, kind of suits those guys, actually. And I think that's something we don't really talk about enough.
Yeah, and this is another really interesting thing, because if you read, so there is a part of the radical left that is anti-immigration, right? And the Zara Wagenknecht used to be the best example of this in
German politician.
Germany, German politician, right? And her argument was, well, capital is clearly interested in a lot of migration.
Yeah.
But it's not true. Capital is interested in migrants without rights. It's not interested in migrants with rights. So it's true that there is a sort of, the employers will say, yeah, we need more people. We need more labor force because we have shortage of skills and so on. But if they were people that they'd have to pay properly, that could be unionized, that could fight for kind of bargains for their wages and put pressure on capital, of course they wouldn't want them. And this is the mistake of this radical part of the left that thinks that it's defending domestic workers by antagonizing them and by saying, well, it's migration is a problem because clearly foreign working migrants capital loves them. They don't love them. They just love people who have no rights.
So on that point, it's been referred to as the Boris wave, which is this massive wave, and it was massive wave of economic migration to this country after COVID. You get net migration in 1 year, I think 23 of 900,000 people. Just extraordinary migration to this country, historically unprecedented. And, there's a right-wing critique of that, which would censor on class, which is that was done because we'd left the European Union, there had been COVID, and clearly you were going to see upward pressure on wages. That was happening, actually. And so there was a concerted effort by the ruling class to compress wages, partly through quote unquote, the Boris wave. Now, what you would say is what you've just sort of said there is, well, if you have things like closed shop unions, high level, it kind of doesn't matter. And I agree with that. So I think you're both right. But then, and this is something that I kind of buy this. Let me put like a policy sort of pushback to you. Somebody from the right who agrees with all that, So they've got a critique of capital and how elites use poorly regulated migration to their own advantage, and also that politically that helps them because it lets them mobilise a distinctive electoral constituency to help them, right? Gary Stevenson says this about Elon Musk. Elon Musk wants to talk about migration for two reasons. First of all, but he doesn't want to solve it because it helps him politically, but the cheap labour really helps the economic model they have. So they want to talk about it, they want to make it a problem, but they don't want to solve the problem. Somebody might agree with all of that watching this, a thoughtful conservative, but they would say, Lea, in 2023, 900,000 net migration. We only build 150,000 homes in this country every year, maximum, by the way. The target's 300,000. I think some years it's 100,000. How on earth can we address the housing crisis if you have 900,000 people arriving in 1 year, 700,000 people in another year, 600,000, which is, I think, that 3-year period? If you're only building 150,000 homes, but you're having net migration of almost 1 million in 1 year, what would you say to that person?
Well, I say you've got a lot of people who have multiple houses. And so why would you level down as opposed to start from the top? Why would you start from the bottom, trying to think about it? I mean, the pile of the state it's not a fixed cake, right? It's about policies and how you intervene and which groups you affect. So if you had a class perspective on political conflict, you'd say, well, you have a lot of pretty rich people with 15 houses. And, why should someone have 15 houses? And for what reasons that are empty and are just there for speculation and I think redistributive, and this is just an example, right? So it's tit for tat. So we're talking about houses. I'm saying, well, we don't have enough houses. And I'm saying, well, actually, we do have enough houses if you look at families who have multiple property and how you can think about inheritance tax. You can think about all kinds of policies that go in this direction. But none of these policies are going to cut it if you don't have a reading of conflict that is a class-based reading that says the problem is the concentrations of wealth and concentrations of capital, and that then has an impact on what goods and what resources certain groups of people have access to. And the task of redistribution is to be, if you're thinking socially or if you're socially minded, even as a sort of moderate, you don't have to be a socialist, you can just be a kind of radical social democrat. The task of the state is to think about all these different constituencies that it needs to cater, and the point of representative democracy is to make sure that there aren't these huge differentials in wealth and power, and therefore it's not acceptable that some groups can wield this much wealth and have this much power and others have nothing. And so it's just a very basic point of redistribution. So it's not true because there isn't a kind of pile that is fixed and that you have to within that decide what's here and what's there. It's more about what kind of policies you have in place which are determined by what kind of political vision you have. But of course, if you don't have a political vision that reads society in those terms, that thinks about class differential, that thinks about the migration, for example, in terms of what does it do to the rich, what does it do to the poor, who does it affect most negatively, and how does it advantage other people? I'm sure there's a lot of, if you want to talk about immigrants, a lot of immigrant investors that have bought huge amounts of property in London that are just locked up and nobody even knows what's happening in there. And, well, you could start from there.
Yeah, well, actually, a lot of it's being built right next to us right now. I think the site manager probably wouldn't tell us the details, but I'm pretty sure a lot of it's being bought by non-UK nationals.
Yeah, so you could start with the kind of foreign oligarchs and take their assets.
Yeah, and you certainly, the thing is as well, if you're having 300,000 net migration per year, you know what, you might have problems if you don't believe in state management and some level of oversight by the state. You might have problems, sure. Yeah.
So can I also say something about this? It's also very important because right now we've been talking about migration at the point of arrival, right?
Yeah.
And of course, the right has again an interest, and the mainstream has an interest in talking about migration on, what happens. Suddenly, one day you wake up and you find yourself with all these migrants that have this emergency at your door. I just don't believe any of that. I think also the academic research on this is very clear that migrants are not a net burden on society. They're usually net beneficial. Let's not even go there, okay? Let's just stick to the kind of right-wing discourse on this. And let's assume that it is a problem and that these numbers are a problem and that they pose a problem for the welfare state. So this is just, you wake up one day and you realize there are all these migrants. The question is, where do they come from and why do they come? And so usually the triggers of migration are war, poverty, environmental disaster. So what are these countries and what are these politicians doing to solve at source? What are they doing for environmental questions? What are they doing to make sure that there are no wars in the world that produce migration? Because most of the waves of immigration in the last few years have all been triggered by wars funded by the West and supported by the West. And what are they doing for global inequality, for issues of access to certain goods and services north-south and divides between different parts of the world that have unequal development? What are you doing at the level of reforming of international institutions? If you don't think about where does the problem come from, how does it arise, how does migration become a problem? I don't think it is a problem, but let's assume it is a problem. To solve a problem, you don't start with when you're with the problem. You start with the causes of it. So that's why migration is not a problem, because it's not actually the cause. As the cause is not the movement of people. The cause is what triggers certain categories of people, usually vulnerable people, to move under conditions of helplessness. And again, the conditions are not the same for everyone. It's not if you're Lea from Albania and is coming on a visa for, brain, for talent or high skilled and so on. The conditions of migration are very different. If you're someone who is running away from war, the conditions are very different. So if you don't you don't tackle the causes and you keep thinking about the problem as the movement of people and membership as a solution, then you're really not really addressing the problem, and you're actually not interested in addressing the problem.
A week before we recorded this, or maybe it was a few days ago, no, it was about a week, the Prime Minister of Yemen was killed by Israel, right? They blew him up in an airstrike. And you have loads of people online, primarily Americans, I have to be honest, saying, well, the Houthis aren't the legitimate government of Yemen. The actual government is in Aden. And so, well, the Houthis control, I think, about 95% of the land area. They have a monopoly on violence. They are the state, okay? If you're killing the Prime Minister of a country, you are basically saying it's okay for that state to become a failed state. You're basically saying that. That's generally what happens. If you kill the government of a country, the government will collapse. And these people genuinely don't seem to understand the causal relationship between blowing up prime ministers, failed states, regime change, and then in 10 years, when you have thousands of Yemenis on small boats crossing the channel, they don't understand how one leads the other. Right now, there aren't many Yemenis coming to the UK. There will be. Or Iranians. So, well, the Iranians that are coming, they're not really refugees, they're economic migrants. The country has the most stringent economic sanctions in the world. I'm sure they are economic migrants. I'd leave too. You're trying to destroy the economy through sanctions. Of course they'll leave. So I think this is a terrain that I think the left has really just given up on.
Yeah, and
talking
also,
about the causes of this
well,
stuff.
absolutely. And also even these distinctions, the distinction between refugee and economic migrant. I constantly get asked this, why are these Albanians coming? They're not refugees. And I'm like, if you're someone who just needs to run away from a desperate situation, you don't ask yourself, am I a refugee or am I American, or where shall I go? Because if I'm a refugee, then it just doesn't work like that. Nobody's had ever any experience of countries of out-migration or of war or of any problematic scenario. Just doesn't understand how this type of thinking works in practical terms. And so the fact that you think these categories will do any work in dissuading people from leaving or from operating in a certain way, it's just so far removed from reality that it makes me laugh, because they usually, they talk to the left and they say, if you're a left, you're utopian and you're idealistic and you don't really know how the world works. And yet you look at how migration, for example, is articulated and conceptualized. And as you say, this is a very good example of, you don't know how the world works. So who is the one who is lacking in realpolitik here? You've no idea of how people are motivated and how diasporas are formed, what triggers migration. If you don't start with what triggers migration, you're just not serious in solving the problem.
I was reading a great book recently about Margaret Thatcher and her she had massive misgivings about German unification, right? Massive, because I think she wanted, Britain to be the major military power in Europe. But she was a smart woman, as much as I disagree with most of her sort of political choices. She kind of understood a few weeks after the fall of the Berlin Wall that the integration of Eastern Europe into a broader European economic entity would probably expose Britain and Western Europe to immigration from the Middle East. Because all of a sudden, if you become a single market, and I'm like, wow, she really got it. She was a very clever lady like that, and it really got me thinking how recent a lot of this stuff is. Finally, before I go to the last question, this thing about net burden, because I know you're doing a thought experiment. You're saying, okay, well, even if they are a net burden, and people come up with all this data of, well, look, they're using more state resources than they provide through taxation, and that may be true for some people, I'm sure, many people. But if you're a Marxist, of course, the value they're providing isn't just through taxes, it's also through the value they have given through exploitation. So sure, if somebody is a minimum wage cleaning lady in central London for 35 years, who then gets dementia in old age, maybe they are a net quote-unquote drain on society because that care is very expensive and they didn't pay much in tax. But they didn't pay much in tax because they were being exploited to the upteenth degree, and probably they may have been living in some kind of social housing because that's a state subsidy towards corporations to give low pay to workers. So actually that person was a major net a net asset to the country. It's just, where was the value going? Sure, it wasn't going to the state. It was going to private businesses and her employers. I mean, we should probably be saying that's Marxists.
Well, I mean, the point that Marx makes, he has all this in Capital, which I happened to reread. There was a nice, interesting recent translation of Capital, Volume 1 of Capital. And so we had a reading group at the LSE, and we were kind of discussing some of these questions. But of course, Marx says the liberals love to talk about the working class as parasites, but like, who are the real parasites of society? People who don't work and just their entire purpose in life is to make money out of exploiting the people who actually work. So there is a whole... But I also, going back to this question of migrants as net burden and net, I actually don't also like the way in which many people on the left, and I've noticed this from many conversations, this is why I said I don't want to go there, because I have also moral problems with that. I don't like the discussion around migrant workers as resource. Just in resource terms, is it a benefit, is it a burden? Because I don't think humans should be spoken of in those terms. It's like, I'm a Kantian, and I think it's sort of a violation of this very basic Kantian principle to not think of people as mere means, right? You're just thinking of them. If you're making
but for capitalism, they are.
Yes, of course they are. No, exactly. But I think sometimes you hear this. This is why, of course, for capitalism they are. But for people on the left who want to push back against that argument, often they will bring out research, which there is a lot of, that says, no, it's not true because they feel labor shortages. They actually, a friend of mine at the LSE did a search that said that children of immigrants in schools, she did a lot of empirical research on this, and she showed that, in fact, not only do they not hold back English-speaking kids, but because they are from immigrant backgrounds, they like to think of themselves as, they need to work hard and have a kind of ethos of achievement in society that actually pushes other kids to work harder as well. So it brings the level up rather than bringing down. So the discourse is in school, in Germany as well as in this country, in schools, immigrant background children hold back native English speakers because when they come to school, they don't really speak the language. And so the state has to invest resources in training them and making sure they speak. And so she did all this research. She's a labor economist. And she did all this research to show that, first of all, children learn languages very quickly. Second, because they have this immigrant background, they have an ethos of achievement that raises the standard rather than bringing it down. So now, there's all kinds of arguments that you could be making, but I think if we only put our energies into making those types of arguments, then again, we're not really getting out of the discourse, because then the discourse becomes instrumental and becomes about, are migrants and net benefits, are they a resource or are not a resource? And that's more or less the same categories of analysis that I think are kind of morally objectionable. So this is why I don't usually drive with that, but I could have a very long argument with anyone because actually migration, one of the things I've been working on for a long time, I'm a political theorist, I don't do a lot of applied work, but this is one of the questions where I have done a lot of also applied research. So I've seen a lot of numbers and a lot of, all kinds of data that you are given about the migrants come and stay. No one talks about circular migration. So often migrants come, stay for a period, then they go back. This, so all this interesting research that nobody's ever bringing up in the public sphere and has no impact on migration, and in many ways shows you how isolated academia is, because we're having all these fantastic conversations amongst colleagues, and then you go out and you see Nigel Farage winning elections. But surely that's also about how our political system is not really channeling all the right energies.
I mean, I do agree with you that the whole discourse of, actually, migration's good because, they help maintain the welfare state and they're good for it. I don't buy that for a second. And I actually think we've now got to the point where the left is so behind on this stuff politically that I think there's lots of people on the right who said, even if you're right, I don't care. Right.
Yeah.
Even if it means I can retire a year earlier, because of migration, or that GP waiting list will be a few days short. I don't care. And I think this is about two things. So firstly, about a re-enchantment of politics we've had since 2008, a re-enchantment of the world in the Weberian sense, but it's happening only on one side of the political divide, which is the right, and the rise of neo-reactionary politics, and then also growth. We had Jason Hickel on recently, a fantastic guy, and he's talking about how we need to have degrowth. Which doesn't mean, by the way, just no growth. It means growth of some things and degrowth of other things. But I think the right are very happy to say, yeah, let's have degrowth. Great. I care about the nation, the family, and faith. That's what I care about. So if let's have stagnant GDP for 20 years. Who gives a toss? And so they're at that level, and we're not, and it's a bit of a worry. You said, and I'll finish with this actually, although I think I'm going to ask you another question after, so I shouldn't say that. You said that the right is setting the sort of agenda through we can solve all problems by just asserting who's in and out identity. And the left makes these appeals to law and bureaucracy. And implicitly, you seem to be saying that's, well, it is obviously empirically a failing strategy. Expand on that. What do you mean by that? And why is it failing?
Well, because I think law depends on politics. And so, of course, we now happen to have relatively progressive legal institutions, which are the result of progressive struggles that have been going on in the 20th century, mostly by social democratic parties. This is the other, big oblivion from what we learned from the 19th and the 20th century. We've learned that actually now everyone is a Democrat. Of course, in the 19th century, not everyone was a Democrat, and the liberals were not Democrats. There was a very clear difference between a liberal and a Democrat. And a Democrat was someone who exactly wanted to have citizenship without property qualifications and universal access to certain rights and so on. And so even the kind of rule of law, the liberal rule of law, was actually not really necessarily promoted by just the liberals or the conservatives. It was mainly pushed by people who were socially minded. I don't want to say socialist because it depends on what period we're talking about. But to make the general point that the law is one way or another, depending on what kind of political movements and forces and what political agency there is behind it. So now we're at the point where we can, to some extent, rely on legal institutions, and it's no coincidence that the right is fighting so hard against judges and against courts, and because the law has entrenched certain socially progressive norms as a result of the struggles of the past century. So there has been this. The problem is that I think the left has kind of forgotten this connection between law and politics. And so it thinks that the law somehow upholds itself and upholds the right standard. And law depends on power, like everything. So if you want to have progressive law, you need to have a progressive politics. And if you want to have progressive politics, you have to have a narrative of what is wrong with the society in which you live and a kind of critique of the system that enables you to channel that narrative. The left doesn't really, the left, I don't know. There is a radical left that obviously has a critique of the system. The mainstream left, the center left, the old social democrats, who all emerged out of this critique of capitalism, have completely forgotten about the critique of capitalism. So they think that, you can, with law, regulate capital and you can give certain claims to people and that there are policies and institutional tools through which you can regulate conflict in society. So has kind of abandoned politics and sees its only task as coming up with policies, which is why whenever people ask me, what will the future society look like? I think, don't worry about that, because the left has come up with so many policies over the last decades. They have great ideas about everything, wages, democratizing the workplace, firms, deliberative democracy, experiments with juries, with representatives. This is just like, thousands and thousands of pages that have been written on all kinds of subjects. And I'm only now mentioning the ones that I know a little bit about, but I'm sure there's the same is for the environment. The same is you name it, and they'll give you a menu of amazing policies. What does it have? What does it not have? It's a politics that can bring together all these different policies and say, well, this is what's wrong with the system, and this is how we can come to a better society, and that better society will then look like with A, B, and C. The right has no policies, zero, not one, on anything. You start from migration. But they have great dreams. They can sell these amazing ideas of belonging and make this great and do this and so on. So they have a kind of politics and they understand how conflict in society works. They understand that they just need to kind of keep banging on with this, and nobody's even going to hold them accountable on the policies because everyone is going to spend so much time talking about the visions. And I think if you don't, and going back to this question, what is the problem with the rule of law and with the law and politics, is that we've missed this connection between law and politics, and we've lost politics, and we've just now basically reduced to defending the welfare state or some kind of liberal minimal norms, and without really thinking about how the state is actually, at any given point in time, just reflects the power relations of that moment. And with law, with a little bit of delay. So as I say, law is still looking relatively progressive. You still have these human rights frameworks and international conventions, and they're not going to be there. And they will disappear in the next 10 years. There will not be anything of that left, because you can really see this attack on the judges and courts. And yeah.
I'm glad you say, because you said I don't like to make predictions, but I think it's really important to say, look, within 10 years, I think the ECHR is gone. And you know what? Maybe even the Labour government gets us out of the ECHR, actually. I think refugee convention, I think that's finished. I think that they'll basically get rid of asylum as a thing. I think it will just be an act of parliament. And, they can do that. If you want to let in 200,000 Ukrainians in 1 year, okay, act of parliament. But as a continuous sort of legal process that will end. All that stuff's going to go, and I you can see it happening in slow motion. And the next big campaign for, like, you know, these sort of vacuous liberal sort of pseudo social democrats, and they're not even social democrats, will be, we have to defend the EHRC, right? We have to defend, and they'll be like, just rally around. And I agree. And by the way, the right's going to get rid of the EHRC, and actually it's the refugee convention they need to go after. But that they know that, but that's good, because then they can drag it all out, right? But the reality is, you're not going to get more than like 20% of the country running around a legal document nobody's ever heard of before.
Yes, right.
And I mean, I was in a cafe the other day. I live in Portsmouth, and I was in a cafe. The people there are lovely. The staff are lovely. This dude just walked across the road. He works another place. He sits down. He chats to them all. And he goes, oh, I used to be a socialist until I, was in the real world. And that makes me chuckle. You hear it all the time, whatever. And then he said, we need to leave the HRC. And I'm thinking, this guy hadn't, and it's not to diminish him. Maybe he's a very thoughtful, intelligent man. I don't know the guy. I'm not going to judge him. But I can be pretty sure he hadn't heard of that until about maybe a year ago. And now he has such strong opinions. It can't be reformed. We have to leave. And, and like you say, like that's how they operate.
Yeah, but also it's also the logic of nationalism, right? That you begin by undermining international institutions.
Yeah.
And of course, the ultimate outcome of that, but I don't want to say because we're at the end, and I don't want to be a prophet of doom, is war, because you begin to dismantle the framework of international agreement, of diplomacy, of international cooperation, of negotiations. Every state is out there. It becomes the war of all against all. And then what do you do when you have nothing of this left and you still haven't solved the problem? Well, you fight. You go to war. And so this is why I think this is the nationalists. I always keep saying this, the fascists, they don't necessarily want to go to war. It's just a kind of logical conclusion of having this vision of the world that is everyone is out to defend themselves. And there is no solidarity, no cooperation. It's my nation. My country needs to become great again. Well, if everyone wants to make their country great again, it's not going to work very well because they can't all be great at the same time. So it's the logic of the argument that leads to destruction. And I don't think anyone needs to want that. And none of these politicians, in fact, if you read what they say, Orban, Meloni, it's not like they're saying, let's go to war. It's usually the liberals that are like, there is war, we're in war circumstances in Europe. But it is, in the end, the narrative changes, the culture shifts, the discourse, it becomes, against the problem becomes, as it was in the 20s and 30s, the League of Nations. The League of Nations is the problem. The Geneva was the site of the League of Nations and the free trade agreements. It's these, the elites, they don't understand the people. All this discourse, if you don't have a progressive critique of the elites, which is necessary, which is, again, to go back to where we started with what is it about the Marxist tradition that's interesting. It does have an account of power and law and the state and a critique of elites, but it doesn't take the nationalist form. So if you don't have that from a different corner, then of course you will end up with where we are and with potentially worse. But I didn't want to go there, actually, because I just don't like to talk about it.
No, I think it's important to talk about because, I think we're still at a moment where that's sufficiently far away that we can avoid it, right?
Right, exactly. That's right. So we talk about, exactly. So we talk about it as a kind of cautionary. Exactly.
The tanks are coming in over the border and go, oh God, here we go.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right. And that is the point of actually talking about it and making these parallels with the past is not to say, well, this is where we're heading, is to say, well, how can we stop it? And how can we learn from the past and avoid doing exactly the same things?
See, that's the thing as well. There's lots of doomerism around. And I think that's why it's really important to be optimistic. So let me explain what I mean there. You can walk out of here if you're on a decent income. You can walk out of here and you can go into a supermarket and you can buy produce and goods from around the world. You can procure any service you want. A bit like Keynes, before the First World War, he's saying I can buy anything and the next morning it's at my doorstep, kind of thing. We have extraordinary technology, extraordinary medical advances. Infant mortality has crashed. People are living longer as long as they're middle class or wealthy in this country. People are traveling more than ever. Like, there's lots of good stuff. The 20th century was a disaster. It was a horrific disaster, as you chronicle so beautifully in your two books. But lots of good stuff happened as well. Let's just try and preserve the good stuff, and let's try and mitigate and sort of remove the bad stuff. And there is bad stuff. Of course there is. The elites are out of control. Of course they are. And that's why we need, like you say, a progressive critique of them. But
talking about this, it reminded me, there's this piece, because we were talking about Zweig in The World from yesterday, where he says it was so inconceivable that you saw these planes that were flying across countries. And, he was talking also about how there were this moment of globalization, cooperation, openness, cultural, why would he see it was talking to his French writer friends and to his German writer friends, and they had all this meetings of international artists doing these visionary projects and these ideas of emancipation and so on. So to him, there were also, like, these were the world of yesterday also had good things, right? And yet that you read the story and you think, okay, so this is clearly, this was also one-sided, right?
And it's not a spoiler, but for people who are like, what book are they talking about? This is a guy who basically grew up in Vienna, and he lives through the First World War. I mean, it's just, actually, I think with each passing week, it feels like a more relevant book. You know, he talks about being, I think, in Ostend on the Belgian coast
Right.
in the days before the First World War.
Yeah, right.
And everybody's like, nah, it's fine. It's fine.
Yeah, exactly.
And, you know, and then something similar happens with the Second World War. And it's not a spoiler. You know, this guy basically goes to Brazil, I think it was, wasn't it? He went to South America with his wife or partner, I think it was his wife. And he writes this whole book and then he kills himself.
Yeah,
right? I think in 1941, 42.
Yeah. It's just unbelievable. Unbelievably depressing, yeah.
I think one of the most important books of the 20th century, and like, wow, you know, that wasn't very relevant in maybe like the 1970s or whatever, but like it's so unbelievably relevant today. And I'm really happy you said that about conflict, because, you know, you've got kids from different heritages, so do I. And I think we need to protect that kind
Absolutely,
of society.
I agree.
And I'm really worried that we're going to go
Exactly.
back to the world of your grandmother growing up. Which you talk
Well,
about in the book.
yeah, exactly. And the world where they start by saying, as I kind of document in the book, you know, they start by saying we will go after the Orthodox Jews because they don't really integrate and they're kind of outliers and they have these strange practices. And then they end up and people like my Jewish character in the book, Dr. Elias, who is a progressive, secularized, not, you know, always been part of the Salonika elite and so on, kind of thinks, well, it's not really me. You know, they're not really talking about me. And my family is Muslim background. Well, they're Muslim. I'm not a believer. I'm not a practicing Muslim. But when they come for you, it doesn't really matter whether you're practicing or not practicing. So they started with the Orthodox Jews and the people who didn't integrate and who had these strange practices that they somehow didn't fit with the state and who were seemed to undermine other communities. In Salonika in the interwar in the 20s, it was all about what should we do with the Shabbat? What should we do with speaking with schools of certain languages? It starts with language rights, with these questions of day-to-day integration. What should we do with access to the professions? And then it ends with, we're going to find a list of whoever has the surname of Levi. Now, my uncle is called Muhammad Ali. And my brother is called Aslan, and my father is called Ahmed. These are all Muslim names. So if they go for me, and they go for the names, it really doesn't matter what I think about which version of Islam is the right one. This is what's kind of why I think it's really important. And this is what is really scary about this word remigration that's sort of entering the picture, because I think that's a crack through which you can kind of see this completely devastating past that risks being also the future.
You know, I saw a great line by an Iranian guy I follow on X. He's American-Iranian. And he said, Iran is not a fake country. Like, you know, and he lists sort of this typical sort of Iranian bigotry. Azerbaijan's a fake country. You know, it was really Iran, then Russia took it, and now it's its own fake country. We're not a fake country. And he lists off all these other countries because we never deported millions of people for ethnic purity. And I thought, that's actually kind of true. Like, not the fake country bit, but Iran never deported all those people. And, you know, this country, to its credit, not since I'm trying to think the expulsion of the Jews or, you know, best part of 800 years, I'm trying to think, hasn't done that. And that would be such an enormous moment if they did. And again, like, it's really plausible in the next 10 to 15 years. I mean, the front page of the New Statesman this week was the age of deportations.
Well, exactly. I mean, they're thinking about Rwanda flights, and they're thinking about how they can deport, how they can take the prisoners, how Albanians can take the prisoners that are in prison in the UK, how can they send them back to Albania. I mean, of course it will start with that. They're not going to start by, we're going to deport Lea Ypi, obviously, you know, but they are talking about deportation. They are talking about flights. That image for me of the immigrants in shackles in those flights in the US, the White House was tweeting. I thought it was a fake account when I saw it. I was like, this must be some kind of far-right group that has decided. It was the official account of the far-right, of the White House, and was posting these videos. It was a completely dehumanizing image, because even if you're deporting, you don't need to. I mean, this is the other thing. Like, in the past, people were being deported and nobody even knew about them. And now you're doing this same thing with Gaza, you know, you're live streaming. And everyone can see it, stop, we're not that far. We started with deportation in the UK, but you're saying, they haven't deported anyone. Well, I mean, they're getting close to it. They're starting.
Yeah, no, it is starting, exactly. And I'm under no illusions about what the UK has done, but we're clearly moving now to a new level of something. In the book, you talk about a Jewish cemetery in Salonika.
Yeah.
And I tweeted a picture of a body with a JCB digger in Gaza. And I'm thinking it's less than a century ago that Jewish corpses were being dug up, left by the side of the road, and dogs were eating their bones. And now this is happening. And some of the descendants of the people who were subject to that horror, some of the descendants are now celebrating the exact same thing happening to Palestinians.
Yeah, because fascism looks the same everywhere. And those are the features that make it up. This, distinguishing between communities and cultures and people who are claims that are worth respecting and rights that are worth respecting, and making these kind of hierarchies. I think that's a sort of universal categorization, that these distinctions are there and they are part of, if you have a fascist government in power, whether it's a fascist government in Israel or in the US or in the UK, it's not going to matter, right?
This is my final question, I promise. What's really interesting for me, and I'd like to hear your view on this as a British Albanian, what's interesting for me is that when I speak to people that my dad knows in Bournemouth, Iranians, Turks, Afghans, lots of them are planning to vote for reform. Lots of them. And I think this is something which is really lost on white, liberally minded people in major cities. They don't understand the extent to which migrants, first generation and second generation, are actually looking to vote for Farage reform. And for the record, I don't think Farage is necessarily, quote unquote, the problem. I think he's going to unleash something which even he can't control and which is much bigger than him. But that's by the by. People can disagree. The main question is, are you seeing that as well amongst British Albanians, even though as a community they've been so subject to this very poor treatment from the government that they're saying, actually, we're the good Albanians, they're the bad Albanians?
Yeah, I think it's not even about that, because many of them are, they know how they came. Not many of them, some of them who came in via small boats and so came in as illegals, or sometimes many who have been here for a long time have come as Kosovars. So they declared that they were Kosovars. They were actually from Albania, so they could get refugee status. They came at a time when in Albania it was like near civil war, so really severe economic crisis during the financial pyramid scheme collapse of 97, 2 years after the Kosovo War happened. And so they could come to Britain and claim they were Kosovars and get asylum status. So they know that they have come with a kind of wrongful claim and that they sort of cheated their way into British citizenship. But what's interesting for me, and I have some who are very good friends, actually working class Albanians, and it's very interesting because they will, first when they unpack this, they will talk about they all were educated in communist Albania, so they'll talk about the labor theory of value, and they'll talk about the extraction of surplus value and how this is all helping capital and so on. And then I asked him, his worker, right? So I said to him, so who are you going to vote for? Because he gave me this really elaborate account of what was going on and why Albanians were being scapegoated and how they were being exploited and how he was being exploited and all of this. And I said, who are you going to vote for? And he said, I'm going to vote for reform next time. And I said, why are you going to vote for reform? He said, well, it's all about survival. Now I have citizenship. Now I'm illegal. And for me, this shows you that it's all about the narrative. If the dominant philosophy becomes one of survival, it's the war of all against all, and I promise you survival and security, then of course that narrative wins, even if people have very sophisticated ideas. And a lot of it has to do with mechanisms of political education, of activism in society, of, connections between different groups of people. I mean, I don't know how many academics actually have long conversations with working class people, just because I'm Albanian. And there are a lot of Albanians who are working class and they often help me with various things that I need help with. They've become friends. So yeah, I think I have a little bit more social mobility. There's a lot of British academics who've never had a conversation with a working class people, I think. So it's, these friends of mine, as I say, the way they unpack it, it just shows you that the problem is when there is no vision, then you go for the one that is the cheapest and the most obvious. And it does make sense to you. It explains the world in a certain way. And it's only the, elite that is completely out of touch who would go to this guy, who is a very intelligent guy, way more intelligent than a lot of academics I have met, very sophisticated, works all day long. Oh, you're a racist, or you're a, patriarch or something like that, right? So for me, this shows you that there is a gap in communication and a gap in mechanisms of political education and a gap in how we're thinking about politics in society, and a real, in that sense, kind of divide between the elites and what working class people think.
Lea, we'll leave it there. It's been fabulous to have you back on, and all the best with the book.
Thank you very much. That was great.